I was 36 when I moved to Savannah, Georgia, chasing slower days after years of chaos in New York. The apartment I'd rented sight unseen turned out to be a third-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian, all creaking floors and windows that stuck in their frames. But it was mine, and it was quiet, and after the relentless noise of Manhattan, quiet felt like a luxury I'd forgotten existed. The moving truck had left 3 hours ago, and I stood in my empty living room surrounded by boxes I had no energy to unpack. Through the tall windows, I could see the canopy of live oaks stretching across the street, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the late afternoon breeze. Everything here moved slower. Even the light seemed lazier as it filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns across my bare walls. I'd been avoiding the inevitable, calling to set up internet, utilities, all the small bureaucracies that turned a space into a home. My phone had been buzzing intermittently with messages from my former life, colleagues wondering when I'd be back, friends asking if I was having some kind of breakdown, my mother's increasingly worried voicemails. I'd been ignoring them all. When I finally picked up my phone to deal with the practicalities, my hands were shaking slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. The screen was cracked, had been for months, but I'd never bothered to get it fixed. In New York, a cracked phone was just another mark of being too busy, too important to deal with minor inconveniences. I was scrolling through my contacts, looking for the power company's number I'd saved weeks ago, when my sleeve caught on the corner of a half-opened box. The phone flew from my hands, spinning through the air in what felt like slow motion before clattering against the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp and final in the empty apartment. I stood there for a moment, staring down at the dark screen, waiting for the familiar glow that would tell me it had survived the fall. Nothing. "Shit," I said aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the unfurnished space. I picked up the phone, pressed the power button, shook it gently. The screen remained black. 3 hours in my new city, and I'd already managed to cut myself off from the world entirely. There was something almost poetic about it, if poetry could be this inconvenient. The building's front door was propped open when I went downstairs, probably to help with the afternoon heat. I could hear someone moving around in one of the other apartments, the soft thud of footsteps on old floorboards. It was the first sign of life I'd encountered since the movers left, and I found it oddly comforting. I needed to find a phone repair shop, or at the very least, a place to use a working phone to call about the utilities. In Manhattan, I would have known exactly where to go, which bodega sold phone chargers, which corner had the best cell reception. Here, I was completely untethered, dependent on the kindness of strangers in a way that made my chest feel tight. The historic district stretched out before me, all cobblestone streets and wrought iron balconies, tourists with cameras and locals moving with the unhurried pace I was still learning to recognize. I picked a direction that felt promising and started walking, my broken phone heavy and useless in my pocket. I'd gone maybe 3 blocks when I heard someone call out, "Excuse me, are you lost?" I turned to see a man about my age standing in front of a small coffee shop, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was taller than me, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it and eyes the color of sea glass. There was something immediately warm about his expression, the kind of face that invited conversation even from strangers. "Not lost, exactly," I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Just looking for a phone repair place. Mine decided to give up the ghost about an hour after I moved here." He smiled, and I noticed the way it reached his eyes completely, crinkling the corners in a way that suggested he smiled often. "Welcome to Savannah. That's either terrible timing or perfect timing, depending on how you look at it." "How do you figure perfect?" "Forces you to slow down. Can't be checking emails and scrolling through whatever if your phone's broken." He gestured toward the coffee shop behind him. "I'm Elijah, by the way. I work here part-time. Teach at the high school the rest of the time." "David," I said, stepping closer. "And you might be right about the timing thing, except I need to call about getting my power turned on." Ah, the practical concerns of adult life. Elijah's smile became something more conspiratorial. There's a repair place about 6 blocks from here, but they're probably closed by now. However, he held up one finger, then disappeared into the coffee shop for a moment before returning with an old cordless phone. Emergency landline. Proprietor believes in redundancy. I took the phone gratefully, surprised by the warmth of his fingers when they brushed against mine during the transfer. Thank you. I feel like I should buy coffee or something. Coffee's actually not terrible here, despite appearances. Elijah leaned against the doorframe, settling in like he had nowhere else to be. You said you just moved? From where? New York. Manhattan. I was dialing the power company's number, grateful I'd memorized it after calling 3 times in the past week. Career burnout, existential crisis, the usual midlife cliches. Ah, a fellow escapee. There was understanding in his voice, not judgment. I came here from Atlanta about 2 years ago. Similar reasons, different details. The power company put me on hold immediately, tinny music playing through the ancient phone speaker. I looked at Elijah, who was watching me with patient curiosity, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of being seen by another person without having to perform or explain myself. What did you teach in Atlanta? I asked, settling the phone more comfortably against my ear. History. American history, specifically. Still do, just at a smaller scale now. He paused, studying my face. You have that look. What look? The same one I had when I first got here. Shell-shocked survivor of corporate America. His smile was gentle, knowing. Takes a few months to decompress completely. The hold music cut off abruptly, replaced by a cheerful recorded voice telling me my call was important and would be answered in the order it was received. I rolled my eyes and Elijah laughed. They'll keep you on hold for 20 minutes, then transfer you to someone who can't actually help, he said. Southern utilities are an art form of inefficiency. Fantastic. I was looking forward to spending my evening in the dark. Power company closes at 5 anyway. You'll have to call back tomorrow. Elijah checked his watch, an old analog piece that looked like it had stories to tell. But the coffee shop has Wi-Fi if you need to check email or anything. Owner's pretty relaxed about people camping out. I looked through the windows into the coffee shop's dim interior, all mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. It looked nothing like the sleek, efficient cafes I was used to, the kind of places where people worked on laptops with grim determination and ordered drinks with names like Productivity Blend. This place looked like somewhere you might actually sit and think, or read a book, or have a conversation with a stranger. I should probably head back, I said, though I made no move to return the phone. Try to make sense of the boxes. How many boxes? Too many. I think I own more books than furniture at this point. Elijah's expression brightened. What kind of books? The question caught me off guard. In New York, when people asked about books, they usually meant business books or whatever was trending on social media. But Elijah asked like he actually wanted to know, like my answer might tell him something important about who I was. Everything, I guess. Fiction, nonfiction, poetry I pretend to understand. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, suddenly embarrassed by my own enthusiasm. I worked in marketing, but I studied literature in college. Never quite shook the habit. Poetry you pretend to understand, he repeated, grinning. I like that. Honest. What about you? What does a history teacher read? History, obviously, but also... He paused, as if deciding whether to trust me with something personal. I have a weakness for memoirs. People trying to make sense of their own lives, figure out how they got where they are. The admission felt significant somehow, like he'd shared more than he'd intended. I found myself wanting to know what memoirs he'd read recently, what stories had resonated with him, what he was trying to make sense of in his own life. I should let you get back to work, I said, though the coffee shop appeared to be empty except for us. Actually, I'm closing up. Owner's daughter had a recital tonight, so I'm covering the evening shift. He took the phone from me, our fingers brushing again in the exchange. You could stick around if you want. I make a decent cup of coffee, despite what the health inspector might tell you. The offer hung in the air between us, casual, but somehow weighted. I thought about my empty apartment, the boxes I had no energy to unpack, the silence that would greet me when I walked through the door. Then I looked at Elijah's face, open and patient, waiting for my answer without any pressure or expectation. I don't want to keep you, I said, the automatic deflection rising before I could stop it. You're not keeping me. I was going to stay and read anyway. He gestured toward a worn paperback sitting on one of the nearby tables. Company would be nice, actually. Company would be nice. When was the last time someone had said that to me? In New York, my social interactions had been scheduled and purposeful. Networking events, client dinners, drinks with colleagues that were really just work meetings with alcohol. The idea of spending time with someone simply because it might be pleasant felt almost foreign. Okay, I heard myself say. Coffee sounds good. Elijah's smile was immediate and warm. Excellent. Fair warning, though. I'm probably going to ask you a lot of questions. It's the teacher in me. Can't help being curious about people. He disappeared behind the counter and I could hear him moving around, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle clink of cups and spoons. The late afternoon light was starting to fade outside, casting the coffee shop in a golden glow that made everything look softer, more intimate. I settled into one of the mismatched chairs, a comfortable armchair that had probably been someone's favorite reading spot. The memoir Elijah had mentioned was still on the table, something about a woman who'd walked the entire coastline of Ireland after her husband died. I picked it up, running my fingers over the worn cover, wondering what had drawn him to this particular story. Finding anything interesting? Elijah asked, returning with 2 cups of coffee. The smell was rich and complex, nothing like the burnt offerings I'd grown accustomed to in Manhattan. Just curious what memoirs appeal to a history teacher, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. This looks like it was a good story. It was. She spent a year walking, trying to understand grief and solitude and what it means to keep moving when everything familiar has been taken away. He settled into the chair across from me, cradling his own cup. I suppose I identified with the themes. The admission was quiet, personal in a way that made me look at him more carefully. There was something in his expression, a flicker of old pain, carefully managed but not quite hidden. I recognized it because I carried something similar, the particular weight of having had to rebuild yourself after everything you thought was solid had shifted beneath your feet. The walking or the grief? I asked, then immediately regretted the question. Sorry, that's too personal. Both, actually. Elijah's voice was steady, matter of fact. Lost my partner about 3 years ago. Car accident. Took me a while to figure out how to exist in the world without him. The words hit me like a physical blow, sudden and devastating in their simple honesty. I felt my chest tighten with sympathy and something else, recognition, maybe, of the particular loneliness that comes after loss, even if my own losses had been different, less final, but no less real. I'm sorry, I said, inadequate but sincere. Thank you. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the window. It's part of why I moved here. Atlanta had too many memories. Every coffee shop, every street corner, every bookstore had some association with Marcus. I needed somewhere clean, somewhere I could figure out who I was without him. Marcus. The name hung in the air between us, a presence suddenly made real. I found myself wondering about him, what he'd looked like, how he'd laughed, what kind of books he'd read, whether he'd been the type to leave coffee cups around the house or fold his clothes with military precision. The details that make up a shared life, All the small intimacies that become irreplaceable once they're gone. Have you? Figured it out, I mean. Elijah's smile was small but genuine. Some days. Other days, I still feel like I'm walking along that coastline, trying to make sense of the landscape. He looked at me directly then, sea glass eyes holding my gaze. What about you? What are you walking away from? The question should have felt intrusive, too personal for a conversation with a stranger. Instead, it felt like an invitation, a recognition of the honesty he'd offered and a request for something similar in return. I thought about my life in New York, the expensive apartment I'd barely seen, the job that had consumed every waking hour, the relationships that had withered from neglect or never taken root in the first place. The careful emptiness I'd constructed around myself, so complete I'd stopped noticing it until one morning I woke up and couldn't remember why I was getting out of bed. Everything, I guess, I said finally. I had what everyone said I should want: good job, nice apartment, financial security. But I felt like I was sleepwalking through my own life, like I was watching someone else live while I just existed. Elijah nodded slowly, understanding flickering across his features. The successful life that doesn't actually feel like living. Exactly. I was surprised by how good it felt to have someone understand without explanation, without having to justify or defend my decision to walk away from what looked like success. One morning I woke up and realized I couldn't name a single thing that brought me genuine joy. Not one thing. That's terrifying. It was. But also. I paused, searching for the right words. Clarifying, I guess. Once I admitted how empty everything was, the choice became obvious. I could stay and pretend it was enough, or I could leave and try to find something real. So you threw a dart at a map and ended up in Savannah. I laughed despite myself. Close. I made a list of cities I'd never been to, places where I didn't know anyone and no one knew me. Savannah was third on the list. What were the first two? Asheville and Portland, Maine. Asheville's getting too expensive and Portland would have been too cold, Elijah said seriously. You chose well. The easy way he said it, like my completely irrational decision-making process was perfectly reasonable, made something relax in my chest. In New York, everyone would have questioned my logic, demanded to see my 5-year plan, asked about career advancement and retirement savings. Elijah seemed to understand that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that didn't make sense on paper. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee as the light outside continued to fade. The coffee shop felt like a small island of warmth and possibility, insulated from the world beyond its windows. I couldn't remember the last time I'd sat somewhere without feeling the need to check my phone, to be productive, to accomplish something measurable. What do you miss about New York? Elijah asked eventually. I considered the question seriously. The energy, sometimes. The feeling that anything could happen, that the city was full of possibility. But mostly. I paused, realizing something as I said it. I don't think I miss it as much as I thought I would, which is either very healthy or very sad. Probably healthy. If you'd been happy there, you wouldn't have left. What about you? What do you miss about Atlanta? Marcus, he said without hesitation. But that's not really about the city. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. I miss having someone to share things with. Small things. Books I've read, something funny a student said, the way the light looks in the morning. All the daily details that only matter because there's someone who cares about them. The honesty of it took my breath away. I recognized the loneliness he was describing, the particular weight of experiencing your life without a witness, of having thoughts and observations and small moments of beauty or humor with no one to share them with. Yeah, I said quietly. I know what you mean. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt something shift in the air between us. A recognition, maybe, of shared understanding. We were two people who had ended up in the same small southern city for different reasons, carrying different kinds of loss, but united by the common experience of trying to rebuild a life from scratch. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah said, his voice softer now. I nodded. "When you were making your list of cities, what were you looking for? What did you hope to find?" The question cut straight to the heart of something I'd been avoiding examining too closely. I'd told myself I was looking for slower pace, lower cost of living, a place to reset. But sitting here in the gathering dusk, across from this man who'd shared his own story with such quiet honesty, I felt safe enough to dig deeper. Peace, I think. Or maybe just presence. The ability to feel like I was actually living my own life instead of performing it. I set down my coffee cup, my hands suddenly unsteady. In New York, I felt like I was always waiting for something. The next promotion, the next weekend, the next vacation. Like my real life was always just around the corner. And now? Now I'm here, in a city I've never seen before, talking to someone I met an hour ago. And it feels... I searched for the right words. More real than anything I've done in years. The admission hung between us, vulnerable and true. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, embarrassed by my own honesty, but Elijah's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more interested, more present. "I understand that," he said. "Sometimes it takes getting completely lost to find out what real feels like." Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting pools of warm light across the cobblestones. The tourists had mostly disappeared, replaced by locals walking dogs or heading home from work. Savannah was settling into its evening rhythm, slower and more gentle than anything I was used to. "I should probably let you close up," I said, though I made no move to leave. The coffee shop had become a sanctuary. This conversation a lifeline I wasn't ready to release. "I'm in no hurry," Elijah said. "Unless you have somewhere else to be?" I thought about my empty apartment, the boxes that would still be there tomorrow, the silence that waited for me. "Not really." "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There was a warmth in his expression that went beyond simple friendliness, an interest that felt personal rather than polite. I felt my pulse quicken, a flutter of possibility I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "Why?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Elijah smiled, and this time it was different, more intimate, more intentional. "Because I like talking to you. Because you're interesting and honest, and you don't seem to need me to be anyone other than who I am." He paused as if deciding whether to continue. "And because I haven't had a real conversation with someone in longer than I care to admit." The confession made my chest tight with sympathy and something else. A recognition of my own isolation, the way I'd been sleepwalking through social interactions for years, without realizing how hungry I was for genuine connection. "I like talking to you too," I said, the words feeling both risky and necessary. We looked at each other across the small table, the space between us charged with possibility and uncertainty. I felt hyper-aware of every detail, the way the lamplight caught the gray in his dark hair, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his fingers moved restlessly around his coffee cup. "David," he said, my name soft in his mouth. "Can I ask you something else?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Are you... when you were in New York, did you..." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not very good at this anymore." "At what?" "Reading people. Knowing whether someone might be interested." The question hung in the air between us, delicate and loaded with possibility. I felt my heart rate spike, a mix of panic and hope that made my hands shake slightly. It had been years since anyone had asked me that question, years since I'd even considered the possibility of being interesting to someone else. Interested in what? I asked, though I knew what he meant. In men, he said simply. In me. The directness of it took my breath away. No dancing around the subject, no careful euphemisms or coded language. Just a simple question from one human being to another, vulnerable and brave in its honesty. I thought about my life in New York, the careful way I'd avoided examining my own attractions, the relationships with women that had felt more like performances than genuine connections, the way I'd told myself I was too busy for romance, too focused on career advancement to think about what I actually wanted. Yes, I said, the word barely above a whisper. Yes to both. Elijah's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and completely transformative. Good, he said. That's good. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet we'd shared earlier. This was charged, electric, full of unspoken possibilities and the sudden awareness that everything between us had shifted into new territory. I don't really know how to do this, I admitted. It's been a long time since I've been honest about any of this. We don't have to do anything, Elijah said gently. Just see what happens. No pressure, no expectations. The kindness in his voice made my throat tight. After years of high-stakes corporate interactions, of relationships that felt more like negotiations than connections, his simple offer of patience and understanding felt revolutionary. I'd like that, I said. Me too. We sat there as full darkness settled over the city, the coffee shop becoming an island of warm light in the gathering night. Elijah had locked the front door at some point, I hadn't noticed when, and now we were alone in the comfortable intimacy of the after-hours quiet. Tell me something else, he said, settling back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. Like what? Anything. Something I wouldn't know from looking at you. I thought for a moment, sifting through the details of my life for something that felt true enough to share. I used to write, I said finally. Poetry, mostly. Bad poetry, but still. Used to? I stopped sometime in my 20s. Got busy with work. Convinced myself it was impractical. I felt heat in my cheeks again. I brought all my old notebooks with me, though. They're in one of those boxes I'm avoiding. Why are you avoiding them? The question cut deeper than I'd expected. I sat with it for a moment, trying to understand my own resistance. I think I'm afraid they'll be worse than I remember. Or that reading them will remind me of who I used to be before I learned to be practical. Elijah nodded slowly. The person you were before you decided poetry was a luxury you couldn't afford. Something like that. What if they're better than you remember? What if that person was worth holding on to? The possibility hadn't occurred to me, and it made something shift in my chest. For years, I'd thought of my younger, more creative self as naive, impractical, someone who needed to be outgrown. But sitting here with Elijah, seeing the way he looked at me when I mentioned the notebooks, I wondered if I'd been wrong. Your turn, I said, deflecting before the conversation could go deeper. Tell me something unexpected. Elijah smiled. I play guitar. Not well, but enthusiastically. That's not unexpected for a history teacher. I also write songs. Terrible, maudlin folk songs about loss and longing in small southern towns. Now that's more interesting. Marcus used to say they sounded like someone had put a sad country song in a blender with a college poetry course. The mention of his partner's name created a moment of quiet between us, not uncomfortable but respectful. I was beginning to understand that Marcus wasn't a subject Elijah avoided, but rather someone who remained woven into the fabric of his daily life, referenced naturally and without apology. Would you play one sometime? I asked. Elijah looked surprised. You'd want to hear my terrible folk songs? I'd want to hear your terrible folk songs. Something in his expression softened. Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you when you're subjected to lyrics about Spanish moss and broken hearts. I think I can handle it. We talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through books and music, childhood memories and college experiences, the small details that make up a life. Elijah told me about his students, the way they challenged him to explain history as a living thing rather than a collection of dates and facts. I found myself telling him about the marketing campaigns I'd worked on, the strange satisfaction of finding exactly the right words to sell someone something they didn't know they needed. By the time we finally stood to leave, the night had settled completely around us. The coffee shop felt like a warm cocoon, and I realized I was reluctant to break the spell of these hours, to return to the practical concerns of unpacked boxes and morning obligations. I should walk you home, Elijah said as he turned off the lights and locked up. Make sure you don't get lost on your second night in the city. I'm pretty sure I can manage 6 blocks. Humor me. I was raised by a Southern mother who would haunt me if I let a new friend wander the streets alone at night. New friend. The words should have felt casual, but they carried weight, significance. It had been a long time since anyone had called me friend, and longer still since the designation had felt meaningful. We walked slowly through the historic district, in no hurry to reach my building. The streets were quieter now, most of the tourists back in their hotels, the locals settled in for the evening. Our footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestones, and occasionally our shoulders would brush as we navigated the narrow sidewalks. There, I said, pointing to a 3-story building with a wrought iron balcony. 3rd floor. We stopped in front of the building, and I felt the weight of the evening settling around us. In a few minutes I would go upstairs to my boxes and silence, and Elijah would continue on to wherever he lived. The thought filled me with unexpected sadness. Thank you, I said. For the phone, the coffee, the conversation. All of it. Thank you for staying, for talking, for... He paused as if searching for the right words. For reminding me what it feels like to connect with someone new. We stood there on the sidewalk, the space between us charged with possibility and uncertainty. I felt the urge to reach out, to offer some gesture of connection or gratitude, but I didn't know what would be appropriate, what he might welcome. I started, gesturing toward the building. Of course. It's late, but neither of us moved. The moment stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and tentative hopes. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something significant, a decision that might change the trajectory of this new life I was trying to build. David, Elijah said softly, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. His expression was open, vulnerable, touched with the same uncertainty I was feeling. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. The words hung in the air between us. An invitation and a question rolled into one. I felt my breath catch, my heart rate quicken. The careful distance we'd been maintaining all evening suddenly felt fragile, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I stood there in the pool of lamplight, feeling the weight of his patient attention and the possibility of stepping into something unknown and potentially wonderful, balanced on the edge of a choice that felt like it might change everything. The words floated between us in the humid Savannah air like Spanish moss drifting from ancient oaks, delicate and weighted with possibility. Marcus, my older neighbor who lived in the elegant Victorian next door, whose careful tending of his garden I'd been watching from my kitchen window for the past 6 months, stood on his wraparound porch with rain beginning to mist around the gas lamps that lined our historic street. I should have had words ready. Should have known how to respond to the quiet invitation in his voice, the way his dark eyes held mine with a mixture of hope and uncertainty that made my chest tight. But I stood there on the brick walkway between our houses, my evening run cut short by the sudden downpour, feeling like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unnamed. The rain intensified, fat droplets that seemed to hang in the air before finally surrendering to gravity, and I found myself stepping closer to his porch without conscious decision. The scent of wet jasmine and old brick surrounded us, that particular perfume of Savannah evenings that had drawn me here from New York 3 years ago, seeking something slower, something real. "I don't want to impose," I said finally, my voice sounding strange in the hushed atmosphere. The gas lamps cast golden circles of light that made everything feel like a scene from another century, as if we were characters in some story that began long before we arrived. "You wouldn't be imposing." Marcus stepped back slightly, making room, his gray-streaked hair catching the lamplight. There was something careful in his movements, as if he was offering an invitation he'd been rehearsing but was terrified to actually extend. "I was just about to make some tea." "The rain looks like it's settling in for a while." I looked out at the street where rain was already beginning to pool between the cobblestones, where the Spanish moss hung heavy and dripping from the live oaks that had stood here since before either of us was born. My small rental cottage was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been across an ocean. Everything about going home felt wrong. The empty rooms, the silence broken only by the settling of old wood, the way I'd been filling my evenings with books and streaming shows just to avoid the particular kind of solitude that seemed to expand to fill whatever space I gave it. Marcus was waiting, not pushing, just holding space for whatever decision I was struggling to make. I'd been watching him for months from my kitchen window. The methodical way he tended his roses, the careful precision with which he arranged the furniture on his porch, the solitary ritual of his morning coffee at the wrought iron table that faced the street. There was something about his quiet presence that had become essential to my daily rhythm, though I'd never admitted it to myself until this moment. "Tea sounds perfect," I said, and the relief that crossed his features was so profound it made me realize he'd been as uncertain about this invitation as I was about accepting it. I followed him through the front door into a house that felt like stepping back in time, not in a museum-like way, but as if the past century had settled into the walls with the gentle weight of accumulated living. The ceilings were impossibly high, decorated with intricate molding that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when time moved differently. The furnishings were elegant but comfortable, arranged for solitude but not loneliness. "This is beautiful," I said, and meant it. The space felt lived in but careful, like it had been curated by someone who understood the difference between a house and a home. "Thank you. I've been here almost 15 years now, still finding new details in the woodwork." Marcus moved toward what I assumed was the kitchen, then paused, turning back with that same uncertain expression he'd worn on the porch. "I should probably mention, I don't do this often. Invite neighbors in, I mean. I'm not particularly good at spontaneous social situations." "Neither am I," I admitted, which was true. 3 years in Savannah had made me more comfortable with solitude than I'd ever been in New York, but it had also made me awkward around unexpected intimacy. "But this doesn't feel like a social situation exactly. What does it feel like?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. What did this feel like? Standing in his living room with rain drumming against tall windows and the scent of old wood and something indefinably masculine surrounding me? Aftershave, maybe, or the soap he used, something clean and understated that made me want to step closer. "It feels like something I've been wanting without knowing I was wanting it," I said, surprised by my own honesty. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, and I could see him processing my words, weighing them against whatever hopes or fears he'd been carrying. "I know something about that," he said quietly. "About wanting things you don't let yourself acknowledge." He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the soft tick of an antique clock and the steady percussion of rain against glass. I wandered to the tall windows that faced his garden, the same view I'd been admiring from my kitchen, but from this angle I could see the careful planning behind what had looked like effortless beauty. Every plant had been chosen for its relationship to the others, every path curved with intention. It was the garden of someone who understood that beauty required patience, that some things were worth tending even when no one else noticed. I planted most of this after Richard died, Marcus said quietly, returning with 2 delicate china teacups that looked like they'd been chosen for comfort rather than ceremony. Something to do with my hands when sitting still became unbearable. It was the first time he'd mentioned his loss directly, though I'd pieced together from neighborhood conversations that he'd been alone for several years now. The casual way he said it, like stating a simple fact rather than exposing a wound, made me understand that this was trust, offered carefully and without expectation. "It's extraordinary," I said, accepting the tea and breathing in the scent of bergamot and something floral. "I've been watching it change through the seasons from my kitchen window. I hope that doesn't sound like I've been spying on you." A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Not spying. Appreciating. I'm flattered someone's been noticing besides me." We settled into armchairs positioned to face the windows, close enough for conversation but not so close as to feel presumptuous. The rain had intensified into something more serious now, the kind of steady downpour that Savannah summers were famous for, turning the streets into temporary rivers and the air into something you could almost swim through. "I have to admit something," Marcus said, his voice careful. "I've been hoping for an excuse to invite you over for months. Every time I saw you in your garden or walking past on your evening runs, I'd think of reasons we might need to talk. Borrowed tools, garden advice, anything that would justify more than a friendly wave." "You could have just asked," I said, though I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about the careful distance we'd maintained, polite neighbors, nothing more, that had felt safer than acknowledgement of whatever current had been running between us. Could I have? I'm 58 years old and I haven't been entirely sure, that is, I wasn't certain you'd be interested in... He trailed off, his cheeks flushing slightly. I'm not very good at reading these situations anymore. It's been a long time since I've had to. The vulnerability in his admission made something loosen in my chest. I would have said yes, I told him honestly. I've been hoping you'd ask. Really? Really? Do you think I take that many evening runs past your house by accident? His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face from careful reserve to something warm and genuine. I wondered about that. You seem to have a very consistent route. Consistently past your front porch around 6:30 every evening. When I'm usually watering the roses. Exactly when you're usually watering the roses. We looked at each other in the soft lamplight, and I could feel something shifting between us, the careful politeness of distant neighbors evolving into something more honest, more direct, the recognition of mutual interest, of time spent in parallel hope. "This is ridiculous," I said, shaking my head. "We're both adults. We could have been having conversations like this for months." "But we weren't ready for conversations like this months ago," Marcus said thoughtfully. At least, I wasn't. I needed time to remember how to want something for myself instead of just getting through each day. His words hit me with unexpected force because they named something I'd been struggling with since moving to Savannah. The difference between surviving and living, between filling time and actually inhabiting it. I'd come here to escape the chaos of New York, the relentless pace that had left me exhausted and disconnected, but somewhere in the pursuit of slower days, I'd lost track of what I actually wanted those days to contain. "I understand that," I said quietly. "I came here looking for peace, but I think what I found was just emptiness. Beautiful, comfortable emptiness, but still emptiness." "And now?" I took a sip of tea, buying time to find words for something I was only beginning to understand. Now I'm sitting in your living room drinking tea and realizing I haven't felt this present, this engaged with a moment since... I paused, thinking. Since Elijah. The name slipped out before I could stop it, carrying with it a weight of memory I hadn't meant to introduce into this tentative space we were creating. Elijah? Marcus asked gently. No pressure in the question, just gentle curiosity. Someone I was with when I first moved here. Someone who showed me what Savannah could be when you let yourself fall in love with it. I set my teacup down with careful precision, surprised by how much I wanted to tell him about this. We were together for almost 2 years. He was a history teacher, gave walking tours of the historic district in his spare time. He had this way of making the past feel alive, relevant, like the stories of this city were stories we could be part of instead of just observing. What happened? The question I'd been avoiding asking myself for over a year. What had happened? I got scared, I said simply. Elijah was intense. Not in a bad way, but in a way that demanded everything. Full engagement, full presence, full emotional availability. He didn't believe in halfway measures. And you weren't ready for that. I thought I was. I wanted to be, but there was something about the way he loved, completely without reservation, like he expected the same in return, that terrified me. So I started pulling back, creating distance, making excuses. The memory still made my stomach clench with shame. Elijah standing in my kitchen with tickets to a weekend in Charleston he'd been planning for months, his face bright with excitement while I made up some excuse about work deadlines that didn't really exist. I convinced myself I was being practical, I continued, that we were moving too fast, that I needed space to figure out what I really wanted. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the possibility of losing something that had become too important to risk. But you lost it anyway. I lost it anyway. The admission felt like swallowing glass. And not just the relationship, but the version of myself that had been brave enough to love someone like that, even briefly. I've been trying to find my way back to that person for the past year. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion, creating a sense of enclosure that made confession feel safer somehow. Richard used to say that love required the courage to be disappointed, he said finally. That the alternative to risking loss was guaranteeing emptiness, and emptiness was a kind of loss too, just slower and less obvious. He sounds wise. He was. Wise and patient and completely uninterested in protecting himself from emotional risk. It terrified me sometimes, how open he could be. Marcus smiled at some private memory. I was much more cautious by nature. Always calculating odds, preparing for worst-case scenarios. Richard called it my disaster planning. He said I spent so much energy preparing for things to go wrong that I sometimes forgot to enjoy it when they went right. Did he cure you of that? Not cure, exactly. But he helped me understand that some things are worth the risk of losing them, that the fear of loss can become its own kind of loss if you let it. His voice grew softer. I wish I'd learned that lesson before he got sick. I wish I'd worried less about our future and paid more attention to our present. Do you regret being with him? Knowing how it ended? Never. The word came out fierce, immediate. I regret the time I wasted being afraid. I regret the conversations I postponed because I thought we had infinite time for them. But I will never regret loving him, even knowing what I know now. Something shifted in my chest at his words, a loosening of a knot I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. I wish I could say the same about Elijah. Maybe you can. Maybe it's not too late to change how you think about that story. It is, though. Elijah's moved on. He's with someone else now, someone who can give him what I couldn't. And I gestured vaguely at the space between us. I'm here. And what's wrong with here? The question was simple, but it cut straight to something I'd been avoiding. What was wrong with here? Nothing, really, except for the story I'd been telling myself about what here meant. That it was exile rather than choice, settling rather than seeking, running away rather than running toward something. Nothing's wrong with here, I said slowly. I think I've just been so focused on what I lost that I forgot to pay attention to what I might find. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent on my face. And what do you think you might find? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and risk in equal measure. I could deflect, make some joke about finding good neighbors or excellent tea. I could keep this conversation in safe territory, maintain the careful distance that had protected both of us for months. But looking at Marcus in the soft lamplight, seeing the genuine interest in his expression, the way he was listening not just to my words but to the spaces between them, I found I didn't want safety anymore. I wanted honesty, even if it was terrifying. I think I might find someone who understands that slow doesn't have to mean empty, I said quietly. Someone who knows the difference between solitude and loneliness. Someone who's been careful for so long that being brave feels revolutionary. Marcus's breath caught audibly, and I watched something shift in his expression. Surprise, recognition, hope. That sounds like someone I'd like to know. I think you already do know him. Do I? Instead of answering with words, I set my teacup aside and reached across the small space between our chairs, letting my fingers brush against his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. The contact was electric, sending small shocks up my arm and straight to my chest. Such a simple touch, but it felt monumental. The first deliberate bridge across the careful distance we'd been maintaining. Marcus turned his hand palm up beneath mine, intertwining our fingers with careful deliberation. His skin was warm and slightly rough, marked by years of garden work and living, and the intimacy of touching him, really touching him, not just an accidental brush of hands over a shared fence, was almost overwhelming. "Is this okay?" he asked softly. "More than okay," I managed, though my voice sounded strange to my ears. We sat like that for several minutes, hands linked, watching the rain trace patterns down the tall windows. The silence between us had weight now, charged with acknowledgement and possibility. I found myself cataloging small details, the way his thumb traced gentle circles on the back of my hand, the sound of his breathing, the scent of bergamot still lingering in the air between us. "I haven't done this in a very long time," Marcus said eventually. "Done what?" "Any of it. Held someone's hand, felt this kind of anticipation, let myself hope for something I wasn't sure I could have. How does it feel?" He considered the question seriously, his brow furrowing slightly. "Terrifying, but also alive, like I've been holding my breath for 3 years and can finally exhale." I knew exactly what he meant. There was something awakening in my chest, something that had been dormant since Elijah, since I'd convinced myself that wanting less was the same as needing less. "Can I tell you something?" I said. "Anything. I've been thinking about you for months. Not just casually, but intentionally. Wondering what your voice sounds like first thing in the morning. What books are on your nightstand. Whether you talk to yourself when you're cooking." I paused, surprised by my own honesty. I've been creating a whole imaginary version of what knowing you might be like. And how does the reality compare? "Better," I said without hesitation. "So much better than I imagined." Marcus smiled, and it transformed his entire face, years seeming to fall away as reserve gave way to genuine warmth. "I've been doing the same thing." watching you from my kitchen window, wondering what you're thinking about when you sit on your porch in the evenings. Whether you're as thoughtful as you appear, or if you're just good at looking contemplative. What's your conclusion? Both, I think. Thoughtful and good at looking contemplative. It's an attractive combination. The word hung between us. Attractive. Such a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like crossing another threshold. From neighbor to something more undefined, more charged with possibility. Marcus, I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. How to bridge the gap between wanting something and asking for it, between recognition and action. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. This, whatever this is. What do you think it is? He was quiet for a moment, his thumb still tracing those gentle circles on my skin. I think it's two people who've been careful for so long, they forgot what it feels like to want something without immediately calculating the cost. And I think maybe we're both ready to remember. The rain outside seemed to intensify, drumming against the windows with renewed urgency. Marcus glanced toward the sound, then back at me. You're welcome to stay until it passes, he said. Or longer if you'd like. I have a guest room upstairs, or the couch is quite comfortable. I don't want you getting soaked walking home. The offer was practical, reasonable, and yet it felt enormous. Like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, not sure if the ground ahead was solid or if I was about to step off a cliff. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with how quickly the words came. If you're sure you don't mind the company. I don't mind, he said, and his smile was soft and wondering. I think I've been hoping for exactly this kind of company. He released my hand reluctantly and stood, moving toward the kitchen. Are you hungry? I could make something simple for dinner. Nothing elaborate, just dinner sounds perfect, I interrupted gently. Can I help? You don't have to. I'd like to. I've been eating alone for over a year. The idea of cooking with someone else sounds... I searched for the right word. Hopeful. Marcus paused in the doorway, turning back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hopeful, he repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. The kitchen was as thoughtfully arranged as the rest of the house. Not large, but efficient, with the kind of worn wooden counters and vintage appliances that spoke of decades of patient use. Marcus moved through the space with quiet competence, pulling ingredients from cabinets and the refrigerator with the unconscious choreography of someone who'd been cooking for himself for a long time. I hope pasta is okay, he said, setting a pot of water on the old gas stove. I make a decent marinara from scratch, and I think I have some good Parmesan. Pasta is perfect. I found myself watching him work, the careful way he chopped garlic, the precise movements as he heated olive oil in a heavy pan. There was something meditative about his process, unhurried and attentive, and I realized this was probably how he approached most things, with patience and care and respect for the process itself, not just the outcome. Can I ask you something? I said, leaning against the counter beside him. Of course. What did you do before you retired? I know you don't work anymore, but I've never known what you did. I was a literature professor at SCAD, he said, adding the garlic to the oil and filling the kitchen with the sound and scent of gentle sizzling. Taught there for almost 30 years. American literature mostly, with a focus on Southern writers. That makes sense. Does it? The way you listen. The way you think before you speak. You have the patience of someone who's used to helping people find their own answers instead of just giving them yours. Marcus paused in his stirring, looking at me with surprise. That's remarkably perceptive. Yes, that was a big part of the job. And I loved it most days. There's something magical about watching a student discover that literature isn't just words on a page, but conversations across time. That Flannery O'Connor or Eudora Welty might have something to say about their own lives. Do you miss it? Parts of it. I miss the students, mostly. The energy they brought, the questions I never would have thought to ask myself. He added crushed tomatoes to the pan, the sizzle intensifying. But I don't miss the politics, or the pressure to publish, or the way everything became about metrics and assessments instead of actual learning. When did you retire? 5 years ago. Richard was already sick by then, though we didn't know how sick. I wanted more time with him, fewer distractions. His voice grew softer. I'm glad I made that choice. Those last 2 years, being able to focus just on each other, they were precious. I could hear the weight of memory in his voice, the way certain losses echo long after the initial impact. It sounds like you had something rare. We did. Not perfect. No relationship is perfect, but real. Solid. Built on friendship as much as attraction. He glanced at me sideways. What about you? What brought you to Savannah originally, besides wanting slower days? It was my turn to pause, to consider how much honesty this moment could hold. Honestly? I was running away from a life that had started to feel like it belonged to someone else. In New York, I was a marketing executive at a big agency. Good money, prestigious clients, the kind of career that looked impressive on paper. But I was working 60-hour weeks for people who didn't know my name, creating campaigns for products I didn't care about. What made you finally leave? A panic attack in the middle of a client presentation. The memory still made my chest tight. I was talking about brand synergy or some other meaningless phrase, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. Couldn't remember why I was there or what any of it mattered for. I excused myself, went to the bathroom, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done anything just because I wanted to, rather than because it was expected or required. So you came here. I came here, bought a one-way ticket, found a short-term rental, and started trying to figure out who I was when I wasn't performing productivity. I smiled at the memory. It took me about 6 months to stop feeling guilty for reading a book in the middle of the day or taking a walk just because the light was pretty. And now? Do you know who you are when you're not performing? It was such an insightful question that I had to think about it seriously. Who was I when I stripped away the career achievements and social expectations and careful image management that had defined my New York existence? I'm someone who notices things, I said slowly. The way Spanish moss moves in the breeze. How the light changes throughout the day. I'm someone who reads entire books in single sittings and doesn't feel guilty about it. Someone who can spend an hour talking to the woman at the farmer's market about the best way to prepare okra. I paused. Someone who watches his neighbor tend his garden and finds it more interesting than anything on television. Marcus turned from the stove to face me fully, and there was something intent in his expression that made my skin feel warm. That sounds like someone worth knowing. I'm starting to think so too. The pasta water had begun to boil, and Marcus added the noodles with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. I found myself mesmerized by the domestic ritual of it, the gentle stirring, the taste testing of the sauce, the way he adjusted seasonings with small, precise additions. It had been so long since I'd shared cooking with someone, since the simple act of preparing food had felt like care rather than just necessity. Tell me something else, I said. Something you haven't told anyone else. Marcus considered this, his brow furrowing slightly. I still talk to Richard sometimes, when I'm working in the garden, or making dinner, or just sitting in the evenings. Not conversations exactly, but updates. Telling him about books I've read that he would have liked or changes I've made to the house. What do you think he'd say about tonight? About me being here? I think he'd be relieved, Marcus said without hesitation. Richard used to worry that I'd retreat too far into myself after he was gone. He made me promise I wouldn't use grief as an excuse to stop living. He glanced at me sideways. I think he'd like you. He always said I needed someone who could match my tendency toward overthinking with actual thoughtfulness. Is that what I do? From what I've observed, yes. You think before you speak. You listen before you respond. You notice things that other people miss. Marcus drained the pasta, the kitchen filling with steam. Those are rare qualities. We carried our plates to the small dining table by the window where we could watch the rain continue its steady descent while we ate. The pasta was excellent, simple but perfectly prepared, the kind of meal that felt like an act of care rather than just sustenance. We talked easily now, the initial nervousness giving way to something more comfortable, more natural. Marcus told me about his favorite students over the years, the papers that had surprised him, the way teaching literature had taught him as much about life as about books. I found myself sharing stories about my corporate years that I'd never told anyone, the absurdity of certain clients, the strange psychology of office politics, the way success in that world often felt like failure at being human. Do you ever miss it? Marcus asked. The intensity, the adrenaline of that kind of work? I miss feeling important, I admitted. There was something seductive about being needed, about having my phone ring constantly and people waiting for my decisions. But I don't miss the person I became in that environment, stressed, competitive, always performing rather than just being. And now? What makes you feel important now? It was such a direct question that I had to pause, really think about it. What did make me feel important these days? Honestly, this conversation. The fact that you asked me to stay, that you wanted to know these things about me. It's been so long since anyone was genuinely curious about who I am rather than what I can do for them. Something shifted in Marcus's expression at my words, a softening, a recognition of something shared. I know exactly what you mean. I spent so many years being Professor Williams, then Richard's partner, then the grieving widower. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to just be Marcus, having a conversation with someone who was interested in me rather than my role or my story. And how does it feel? Being just Marcus? Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. We finished dinner as the rain continued outside, now settled into the kind of steady rhythm that suggested it would continue all night. The conversation had grown more intimate, more personal, the kind of exchange that happens when two people realize they're genuinely interested in each other beyond mere politeness. More wine? Marcus asked as we cleared the table together. That sounds perfect. He returned with a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses, and we settled onto the couch in the living room, closer than we'd sat before, but not quite touching. The wine made me feel loose-limbed and brave, and I found myself studying Marcus's profile in the soft lamplight, the silver in his hair that caught the light, the lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of smiling, the way he held himself with quiet dignity, even in casual conversation. "Can I tell you something?" Marcus said softly. "Anything. I've been attracted to you since the day you moved in. Not just physically, though that too, but the whole presence of you. The way you move through the world with such quiet attention. The way you've been rebuilding your life here without making a show of it." The admission hit me with surprising force. I had no idea. I'm good at hiding my feelings. Occupational hazard of being a literature professor. You learn to observe without being observed. His smile was self-deprecating. But watching you these past months, I started to think maybe hiding wasn't serving me anymore. What changed? Tonight. Seeing you on my porch, realizing I could ask you to stay and you might say yes. It made me understand that some opportunities don't come twice, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try. I set my wine glass aside and turned to face him more fully. "I'm glad you were brave enough." "Are you?" Even though it's complicated, and we're both carrying our own histories, and neither of us knows exactly what we're doing? "Especially because of that," I said, reaching for his hand. "I spent 2 years with Elijah trying to pretend the past didn't matter, that we could just start fresh without acknowledging what we'd both been through before we found each other. But maybe the past does matter. Maybe it's what makes us capable of appreciating what we have now. Marcus intertwined our fingers again, and the contact felt even more electric than it had earlier, charged with recognition and possibility and the particular intimacy that comes from really seeing someone. "I want to kiss you," he said quietly, the words coming out soft and uncertain and completely honest. My heart started beating faster, not from nervousness this time, but from want, pure, uncomplicated want that I'd almost forgotten I was capable of feeling. "I want that too," I whispered. He leaned toward me slowly, giving me time to change my mind, to pull back, to retreat into the safety of distance. But I didn't want distance anymore. I wanted this. The careful way he cupped my face in his hand, the gentle pressure of his thumb against my cheekbone, the way he looked at me like I was something precious and unexpected. When our lips met, it was soft and tentative and perfect. A question rather than a demand, an invitation rather than a claim. I felt something unlock in my chest, some tightly held breath I'd been holding for longer than I could remember. The kiss lasted only a moment, but when we separated, the air between us had changed completely, charged with acknowledgement and desire, and the particular vulnerability that comes with letting someone see you want them. That was... Marcus started, then stopped, seeming to search for adequate words. "Yeah," I agreed, understanding completely. We stayed close, foreheads nearly touching, sharing breath and space and the magnitude of what had just shifted between us. I could feel his heartbeat against my palm where I'd placed my hand on his chest, could see the wonder in his eyes as he looked at me. "I should probably warn you," I said softly. "I'm not very good at taking things slow. When I start feeling something, I tend to want all of it immediately. And I'm probably too good at taking things slow," Marcus replied with a gentle smile. "Maybe we'll find some middle ground." "Maybe we will." The clock on the mantel chimed 10, and I realized with surprise that we'd been talking for hours. It felt like minutes, the kind of suspended time that happens when you're completely absorbed in someone else's presence. "I should let you get some rest," I said, though I made no move to pull away from him. "Should you?" Marcus asked, echoing his earlier invitation. "Or do you just think you should?" It was exactly what I needed to hear. Permission to want what I wanted instead of what seemed appropriate or expected. "I don't want to go anywhere," I admitted. "I want to stay here, on this couch, talking to you until the sun comes up." "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay as long as you want." So I did. We talked until the wine made us philosophical and the rain made us contemplative. Marcus told me about his favorite books, the students who'd taught him as much as he'd taught them, the way Richard had slowly introduced him to gardening as a form of meditation. I shared stories about my New York years that I'd never told anyone, the loneliness hidden behind professional success, the way I'd lost touch with who I was in the pursuit of who I thought I should become. Somewhere around midnight, Marcus found a soft throw blanket, and we arranged ourselves more comfortably on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body along my side. The conversation grew quieter, more intimate, punctuated by longer silences that felt full rather than empty. "This is perfect," I said softly, letting my head rest against his shoulder. "Better than perfect," Marcus murmured against my hair. Outside, the rain had gentled to a whisper, no longer demanding attention but still providing a soft soundtrack to our quiet connection. I felt safe in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Free to be exactly who I was without performance or pretense. "Can I tell you something?" Marcus said, his voice drowsy with wine and contentment. I was terrified you'd say no when I asked you to stay." "I've been thinking about asking for weeks, but I kept losing my nerve." "I'm glad you found it,"